Hey everybody, welcome back to American History with Mr. Finn. Today is a little bit of a shorter one for us because we are honestly just right at the end of Reconstruction. So if you remember, Reconstruction, what are we reconstructing or putting back together? That is right, the United States of America following the Civil War. The North is coming trying to bring the South back into this country during this time period of Reconstruction. Now, this time period, basically we're looking at, just so we have our years, so we know where we're at here, is this time period, in 1865 to 1877. That's the time period that we consider Reconstruction. It wasn't like this time period was, hey, we're going to do Reconstruction, and on this date, we're going to end it. No, it just happens to stop at 1877 with an election. But before we get to that election, let's just kind of recap where we're at. We had the Freedmen's Bureau. These newly freed men are trying to figure out life. How are you going to live? We were in the middle of seeing the rise or the creation of the KKK. And so it's really going to be the KKK trying to keep things the same. The Ku Klux Klan is that underground secret society just designed or created to, again, keep things the same way in the way of keeping the white people in the South in positions of power. The members of the KKK were judges and police officers and doctors and basically everybody was a part of this secret organization. You didn't know who could be or who might be or whatever. So if you were an African American living in the South at this time, this would be a really scary thing. The KKK would, still continue whipping, use the murder. It was a terror organization. In fact, the KKK still exists today, and it just uses this terror to try and keep things the same way. And so, what we're seeing is the North is trying to make the South change. Remember, they had set up military districts, and they were militarily occupying the South. But then behind the scenes, the KKK was, underground terror organization trying to undermine the idea or trying to scrap the Northerners' idea of what it should be like in the South. And that's what this time period is basically the North saying, hey, we need you to be this way, and the South saying, we're not going to change, and we're going to do everything that we've always wanted to do, and wanted to keep it that way. So that is what we're dealing with during this time period. Former slaves were busy finding their family members, trying to get an education, trying to learn how to read and write, trying to figure out how they're going to go about things. But here's basically what happens during the time period for these freed men. There's really only two options. Option one, become a farmer. Now remember, the South was still agricultural based. They would have been growing cotton and stuff like that. So people still farmed a lot in the South. And so a lot of slaves or former slaves are going to become farmers and stay in the South. They might rent land. They had programs set up and they, would become small farmers. Wouldn't be a huge, super rich plantation. They would just be small level farms, just kind of existing and staying alive. But they would be free, not slaves, which is always better. Number two, the option for them, go north. What's in the North? Factories. Factories are jobs. It was hard. You couldn't find jobs in the South. It was, like I said, if you stayed in the South, you're primarily going to become a farmer, or you would take your family and be like, hey, I'm getting out of the South. I'm going north, and you might look for a factory job in New York or in Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland or any of the Midwestern towns, Pittsburgh, stuff like that, looking for work because that's where industrialization had taken hold. So there's a lot of factories in that area. So that is the scene of the South during this time period. These freed men are trying to figure out their way in life, and the KKK is trying to keep things the same. The North is trying to change the South, and it's kind of a crazy time period down in the South during this time. How does it end? 1877, Hayes is elected. Rutherford B. Hayes elected president. Now here's the deal. There was some questions about the total popular vote count and the electoral college vote, and they weren't 100% sure that Rutherford B. Hayes had won against Tilden, who was the other person running against him. But in a compromise that was made, Rutherford B. Hayes says, if I'm allowed to be president, which I probably won this election based on everything we see here, but I know you think it's in doubt, Southern Democrats. If you allow me to be president, I promise I will remove the military from the South. I will end the military occupation of the South. And so obviously, Southern Democrats are like, yep, sounds good. Rutherford B. Hayes, you can be president. And that is in 1877, which is why we call it the end of Reconstruction. The problem now is if you look at the South, what are we dealing with, right? The South now doesn't have military occupation. If you're a freed man, you now live in the South with no support from the North. But who is still in the South trying to do things? That's right, the KKK. And so what is going to end up happening, why we call Reconstruction, is really widely considered, a failure. It fails. Let me make sure that I dragged my marker over there. Reconstruction fails. Because after the military is taken out, what we're going to see is the South returns to the way it was. Now, slavery is illegal. However, the people in the South, the people who are now running this, the governments of the South, are going to use what are called black codes. And they're going to create basically what these would be called or considered are racist laws, or what black codes are. So they would say things like, hey, if you don't have a job, you can go to jail. And obviously, a lot of African American or these freed slaves didn't have jobs. And so it'd be like, hey, you're out on the street. We got to go take you to jail. How are we going to pay off your jail time? Oh, well, you can pay it off by working on this farm, and so you now have to work on this farm. So essentially, it's like, hey, I got arrested, now I have to work off my sentence, and I'm working on a farm, and I'm basically a slave again. And then there's hundreds of different black codes or different ways. We'll look at some voting issues in a little bit, not today, but when we get to it. Today, you're going to tell me 3 things, but I'll tell you that in a second. So what's going to end up happening in 1877 with this election is the white power players in the South are basically free to create this version of slavery that's not technically slavery, but it limited, anyone who was a freed slave. It limited their opportunities and abilities and chances to do anything. So, unfortunately, that's why we say Reconstruction is going to be considered a failure, because in the end, it didn't really change anything. Everything kind of just goes back to the way it was, where white people are in charge, black people don't have a lot of, rights. laws are set against them. It's just an unfair system that exists in the South, and that's going to remain the same, which is the unfortunate part. When we talk about Reconstruction and fighting the Civil War, it ends in 1865. Reconstruction ends in 1877, but we're not going to see the Civil Rights Movement until the 1950s. So we're talking about almost 100 years later before we even have the Civil Rights Movement, which if you don't know about the Civil Rights Movement, you'll learn about it when we get to it. But it was, with Martin Luther King, there was Rosa Parks, there were some other, famous people that you might have heard of, but we will talk about when we get to it. But the Civil Rights Movement was about trying to gain equal rights for African Americans. And that's almost 100 years after the Civil War. So that's what's happening in the South. The South just kind of remains the same. And it takes another 100 years just to get to a point where we can start to change it. Or try to change it, at least. And so, that is the end of Reconstruction. That is the end of our Civil War. We're going to jump into industrialization because as we see at the tail end of the 1800s, at the end of the 1800s, industry is starting to take off. Cities are getting larger. There's some major things that are happening. And that's what we're going to get to next time. For your assignment today, it's pretty simple. We have the 13th, 14th, and 15th. I put the. What am I doing? I'm talking and thinking at the same time. Too many thes. Amendments. These are all amendments, 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. These are all amendments that take place during this time period of the Civil War / Reconstruction, right at the end here. They go together, and all you have to do today is tell me what they are. What are they? Question mark. So, what does the 13th Amendment say? Do you know? Well, you're going to find out. What's the 14th Amendment say? What's the 15th Amendment say? This is short. Amendments are not going, it's not going to be a paragraph and things that you're writing. I just need to know, what does this say? What is it? What was the benefit of these amendments? Or what are they protecting, maybe? Hint, hint. So those are what you're doing. I need that today. Shouldn't be long. Like I said, just the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. What are they? What do they say? What are they doing? What's the importance of them? Just a couple sentences telling me about each one. So should be pretty easy. But yeah, make sure that is to me today for attendance and participation purposes. And I will see you next class.